To this meeting of the Housing Planning and Development Scrutiny Panel. I'm going to start with item 1, which is filming at meetings. I can just draw your attention to the text in item 1. This meeting is being filmed, and if you attend, you are consenting to being filmed. Item 2 is apologies for absence. I've had apologies for lateness from Councillor Moeed. Anyone else? No other. Oh, and Councillor Gordon's given her apologies as well. Item 3, urgent business. I don't think we've received any items of urgent business. And item 4, declarations of interest. Do any members need to declare an interest? No? Okay. Moving on to 5, deputations, petitions, etc. I don't think we've received any. No? Okay. And item 6, minutes of the last meeting. Does anybody have any comments about the accuracy of the minutes from the last meeting? John?
There's 3 actions on page 6 and 7. I don't recollect receiving any update on those actions.
We're just checking that now.
Yes, the actions you're referring to on page 6 and 7 relate to the budget report. Is that correct? Yeah. So I mean, all of the queries that were raised in the panel meeting were subsequently resolved at the 2 scrutiny budget meetings. There was a raft of paperwork prepared and all the written responses were given written answers to in those meetings. So they have been received and they are published under the scrutiny papers.
Okay, and then also on page 4 and 5, it refers to the cost of all the legal advice for the disrepair claims. I'm wondering if we could have an update on that situation. Not now, but can an update be prepared given where we are with that issue?
Sorry, I missed what did the action relate to on page 4 and 5?
4 and 5.
Legal costs for disrepair. Right.
We can add that as an item for a future meeting. Shall we do that? Yeah. Okay. Other than that, are we happy to approve the minutes? All right, approved. Okay, moving on to item 7, which is our first substantive item of business. This is an update on our voluntary undertaking to the regulator of social housing. We have obviously considered this area of work previously, but given that it's ongoing, we thought it was appropriate to have an update as to where we are. So, Jarhead, to introduce this, please.
Thank you, Chair. So this report provides an update on the progress the Council is making with the voluntary undertaking with the regulator. So as the Chair mentioned, we have covered this topic in detail. Just a reminder by way of background, when the ALM were transferred back in-house in June 2022, we commissioned an external consultant to do a review of housing service, particularly the compliance function, and then subsequently in December 2022, we commissioned an external company to do a review of our compliance. Based on the findings of those 2 reports, in January 2023, we subsequently did a self-referral to the regulator of social housing based on our understanding of a potential breach of the home standard. And at the time when we self-referred, we were aware 30% of our stock, our council managed stock, did not meet the decent homes criteria. Following our self-referral, and as a result of our voluntary self-referral, the regulator of social housing published a regulatory notice on 6th of March, which confirmed that we indeed were in breach of the home standard. That notice currently remains live and will remain live until we achieve full compliance. Further to the regulatory notice, in July 2023, we took a voluntary undertaking to Cabinet to confirm what actions we're planning to take in agreement with the regulator to return housing services back to full compliance. So the summary of the voluntary undertaking is included in the report. There are three key areas. One is around governance. The second is data quality and IT system. And the third is around program management and reporting. So from the table, you can see on 3.10, that confirms the detail of our voluntary undertaking. So the first was that we agreed to implement a new governance structure, and that governance structure was put in place fairly imminently. And that governance board meets with me once every 3 weeks to go through the key areas of compliance. The second undertaking we agreed to do was to complete the backlog of overdue fire risk assessments. So I'm happy to confirm we have not had any overdue fire risk assessments for a significant amount of time now. The third was to complete the backlog of overdue high-risk fire risk assessments. So at the time we had just over 4,000 high-risk fire actions, and we agreed with the regulator that it would take us at least until March 2024 to get that cleared. Then we had the, in total, 8,000 properties. We agreed with the regulator where we needed to do a electrical safety certificate, which included properties over 5 years and more than 10 years. We also agreed to improve the compliance reporting and ensure that we bring at least 1,000 homes back into decency levels in 23-24, and we agreed to review and update the asset management strategy, which confirms how long Haringey Council it will take for us to bring all of our properties to decency levels, and then we agreed to procure and implement a new compliance system. So I think as a general update, at the 10 key actions, we have delivered 9 out of the 10. We've got 1 to do, which is due to complete by the end of March. The report goes into detail around the key areas of performance and where performance has improved around compliance. And the tables include a snapshot of what the position was when the ALMA was transferred back in-house to what the current position is. And I think just to further add to this piece of work, we also invited the regulator of social housing to attend a housing improvement board, which is chaired by the chief executive, attended by cross-party members. They reiterated their confidence in the improvement that we are delivering in housing service, or significant improvement we've been delivering over the last 12 months. The final 2 points I just want to quickly elaborate on is, as part of the voluntary undertaking, we did say we will procure a system and it will be in place by April 2024. So that is still scheduled to go live in April 2024. We procured the system. We've done a number of soft launches internally. So that's due to go live in April. And on a final point, myself and David Joyce, since last year, we've been meeting with the regulator once a month to provide an update on our performance. And those conversations will continue to take place up until the point we apply to have the notice removed. Happy to take questions.
Thanks a lot for the report. I'll go to the panel first. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to start with? Councillor Bevan.
On page 13, it says 323 properties have been handed back to Haringey and the tenancy management team are visiting and writing to each. Have I interpreted that wrong, that 323 illegal tenancies have been discovered as a result of these checks? Or is that not what it means?
No, so what this refers to is, if you look at the table just above the paragraph, it will show in December 2022, we had just over 8,000 properties that didn't have a valid electrical safety certificate, which included over 5 years and over 10 years. And as of now, We've done the majority of those properties, with the exception of 75 properties, which is over 10 years, and just under 500 now under 5 years. Now, generally, the approach that we would take is, and these are all due to no access, so we've attempted to go to the property to do the work. The resident has not made themselves available. The process that we would follow is we'd write to them initially, we'd make up to 4 contacts. After that period, the electrical mechanical team will then pass those no access information to the tenancy team to see if they can get access, or see if they've got any key insight into who the residents are, if there's any vulnerability. Failing that, it then goes over to our legal team to then take legal action to go into these properties to do EICR checks.
I mean, that wording is really strange because it says 323 properties have been handed back. I don't quite see how that relates to what you've said.
So
to me,
when we
that
say
means that we've taken the properties back and the tenants were illegal.
No, so when we say handed it back, it would mean the tenancy management team cannot do anything more. So it has to go handed back to our legal team to issue legal proceedings. So obviously we would ensure that we use the legal remedies as a last resort. So if the contractors don't have access, the tenancy team then try to make contact and attempt to gain access. When they hand it back, it means we now have to give it to legal to take court action.
Yeah, that clarifies. The legal bit was missing.
Any other panel members have questions for now? Yeah, Councillor Harrison-Mullane.
Thank you for the report. I think it's really good and really positive to note the progress. I just wanted to ask the 6 indicators of the compliance areas in the tables. You mentioned that these are the big 6. Could you maybe give us an idea of, are there other compliance areas that aren't noted here? What kind of things are they? Yeah.
So these are our statutory requirements around the big 6. So we need to make sure we're doing the fire risk assessments, including following up on any fire risk actions that we pick up from the assessments. There's a statutory and a regulatory requirement to make sure we do the annual gas safety checks, and then we need to make sure all of our homes have a valid electrical safety certificate. And then we're doing the asbestos inspection, and we're aware of properties that may have asbestos. And then we've got the passenger lift inspections and water hygiene. So I think from a legal perspective, those are the 6 that we get measured against. I do think it's probably worth just pointing out, if you look at the 2 tables, you can see, for example, the most recent update shows a decline in performance for gas safety. Actually, from our interpretation and on our view, is actually it's not necessarily a bad thing, because what the information does show is, again, we had access issues to go into these properties to do gas work. We've then gone in, applied to the courts to get warrants, and subsequent to getting the warrants, we've then gone in and done the gas safety, or we've got plans to go and do forced entry to ensure those works are done.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I had one more question, which was, you talked a bit about implementing new systems for recording processes. At previous meetings of this committee, we talked about the kind of lack of IT use in the service before it was taken back in-house, and like things like the use of spreadsheets for recording repairs. Is that what these new systems are addressing?
Yeah, absolutely, Councillor. So when I last spoke on this issue, one of the key risks for that particular service area was they were using spreadsheets, and they had been using spreadsheets for a number of years. And I made a commitment, certainly here, that one of my priorities was to make sure we move that team away from spreadsheets to a compliance system. So we procured that last year. We've been working with our new suppliers beginning of this year to make sure the team from April use a system, so they're no longer dependent on spreadsheets, which are open to human error. And this is a area that the regulator have also been monitoring on us. So it's a commitment we made within the voluntary undertaking that we've delivered.
Thanks, Councillor Hymas.
Hi, yeah, I mean, it's incredibly impressive work to get through these compliance issues at that rate, and I think that's really good. And also noting your article in the Housing Equality magazine, but it was really good, especially what you said about like not having a culture of blame in the organisation, and it sounds like that's been integral to improving the service. So I think that's really positive communications on that front. One of the things I kind of had a question about was that obviously the regulator found that there were 5,000 homes that did not meet the decent home standard, and then around 100 which had category 1 hazards. And I can see that we've exceeded that target of 1,000 no longer not complying with decent home standards. I'm wondering what's the future target for that, because obviously if we're exceeding this, it's good to have ambitious targets for the next year to take forward. And on top of that, do you know how many properties now have category 1 hazards, and is there kind of data around that in terms of compliance?
Yeah, sure. If I pick up on the category 1 hazards, so when we self-referred and had this discussion with the regulator about a year ago, and they noted our high levels of category 1 hazards, one of the things that I said to the regulator at the time was, actually, it's a good thing because that shows we know the conditions our properties are in. So what we currently have is a stock condition survey where we've been going into every single property to understand the condition of those properties, and having visited those properties, the number of category 1 hazards that we may have. Unlike a lot of landlords, and this is an issue across the sector, one of the key challenges they've got is not having the most up-to-date, relevant stock information data because they don't have a stock condition program. We're quite fortunate enough to have a stock condition program that's then given us the intel where we can then tell the regulator, yep, we've got over 100 category 1 hazards. We've got a refined process in Haringey service where when our surveyors go out and do the stock condition surveys, where there is a category 1 hazard that's being picked up, and it may be to do with gas, repairs, tenancy management, those are then referred to those departments to go and then rectify. There are some category 1 hazards we just cannot deal with. One of the issues that has come up, which I've raised with the regulator, is we use the HHSRS definition of category 1 hazards. Within that definition, they've got overcrowding as one of the issues. So we've picked up within our stock, we've got a number of households who are overcrowded. Unfortunately, there isn't a repair that we can do to try and rectify that issue. It is an issue of supply and demand. So there are some category 1 hazards we simply cannot deal with, but the majority which are repair related, we certainly will and have done.
Is it possible to get either that as like turnaround time in terms of identifying and then resolving a category 1 hazard, or, you know, a way to exclude overcrowding, for example, from that data so that we can see that alongside this data around the compliance measures?
Yeah, we can provide you our position on that.
Thanks. I had a couple of questions. Firstly, just on the table at 3.15, could you clarify why fire risk assessments and asbestos re-inspections have a variable frequency as opposed to some of the other types of assessment?
So I believe the first table, so they're all annual checks that we would do. The first table shows what our position was at the point when we self-referred, and the second table shows what our current position is. So fire risk assessment at the time, we had a backlog of fire risk assessments that we needed to do, which is why that table was showing red. Equally, at the time when we self-referred, we know just over 8,000 of our properties don't have a valid electrical safety certificate, which is why that is red. And we also had uncompleted asbestos inspections that we didn't do. So that's why 2 years ago those indicators were red.
Sorry, it just, I appreciate that. It's just in both of the tables, when it, in the frequency column, those two types of indicator are listed as variable, and I just wondered why that was when the others seem to be on strict programs.
Oh, right. So it's some are variable, some are 5 yearly, and some are annual. Yeah. It's based on the regulatory requirements set out in terms of the frequency that we're following those programs against. It's not something that we would dictate.
So, could you, yeah.
I think the different fire risks have a different regularity of needing to inspect. Therefore, it's variable within that category. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to turn as well to, well, this is kind of the end of this report on page 14. I'm having feedback issues. Anyway. That's better. So just at the end of the report, it's talking about obviously the contribution to carbon and climate change. And it says that by undertaking this work, that obviously feeds into the wider energy efficiency agenda of our housing stock. Are there specific things that in carrying out these improvements actually contributes to that, or is that just more referring to our wider decent homes work?
So this would be in reference to the revised asset management strategy that went to Cabinet last year that talks about some of our net zero work that we will be doing to some of our stock.
Okay, so yeah, it's not
specific to the voluntary undertaking yet.
Yeah, thanks. And then just in the actual wording of the voluntary undertaking, which was included as an appendix, I think, or a link, there's two things that it would be good if just to get a bit more detail on. So the first is it says, following the initial period of recovery and upon fulfilling our obligations to the regulator, an external organisation will complete a thorough review and validation and make appropriate recommendations, etc. So could you give a bit more of a sense of when that might be likely to happen and what that would look like?
Yeah, of course. So once we've completed all of the actions, we will be inviting an external firm of auditors to validate the work we've done internally. So not only have we said we've completed it, there will be external auditors who can evidence the work we've done, who can then confirm we've completed it. It's at that point, once we've had both our validation and all of the actions completed, as well as the external auditor's validation, will apply to the regulator to get the notice removed.
And are we going to have to deal with all of those access issue properties first before we can do that?
No, so the regulators are satisfied that as a landlord, we have taken all reasonable efforts and attempts to try to get access to those properties to carry out the work. What the paper does outline is we've got a few test cases on the electrical work. Depending on what the test case determines, we may or may not be able to get a warrant because it's not actually a regulatory requirement. So for gas, for example, we say a regulatory and statutory requirement. For electrics, it's not, which is why we're doing a test case. But the regulators have been quite clear. We don't need to complete the access to the remaining properties to apply for a notice to remove the notice.
Thank you. And then there was just something else in that voluntary undertaking. There's a commitment to engage with residents to understand how safe they feel in their homes, and for our high-rise buildings through implementation of building-specific resident engagement strategies. Is that something that's already been ongoing as part of the sort of wider resident engagement work?
There is wider resident engagement work, but it's not attached to this voluntary undertaking.
So is that something that's going to happen?
Yes, it's already happening, yeah.
Does anyone else have any further questions on this item? Tammy?
Just a final thing. I mean, obviously, it's been pretty shocking on this committee to see just where we were when we insourced Homes for Haringey. And while I appreciate what I had said earlier about not having a culture of blame, I wonder whether there's any scope to do a bit of a lessons learned process to understand like how we got into this position, and so that in other services, whether it's housing or elsewhere, particularly where there's insourcing or outsourcing at play, how we can stop these kind of systemic compliance failures happening.
Can I answer that one, Jahid, just because you weren't here for that period, but you've come in and helped fix a lot of these issues. At the time of the insourcing, we did an independent stock take of the service that was sort of titled the State of the Nation report at the time, that did identify a number of these issues that existed, and did suggest that we do a follow-up piece of work with an external company, which was Pennington Choices, which actually did a whole audit of the kind of situation that we were in, but also a set of recommendations about what we needed to do, some of which go beyond the things that Jahid's talked about tonight, but things like bringing in a new compliance system, which has been put in place. And so there was a whole series of actions and recommendations that the service are taking forward, and that's part of the follow-up work that was alluded to will be to revisit that and get that external assurance again that we've now implemented all of those recommendations. So I think with all of that in place, I'm quite confident we're opening ourselves up to, you know, A, we've done a lessons learned exercise, but B, we're opening ourselves up to getting that external validation on it.
Anyone else, or are we happy to move on from this item? No? All right, thanks very much for that. It's Jahid up again next for the next item. Also, just to note that Councillor Diakides, I think, is leaving the meeting. He might be able to come back later. Thank you. And also to note that Councillor Moeed was able to join us a little while ago. So the next item is on our preparedness for the new social housing consumer standards, and with an emphasis on our approach to tackling antisocial behaviour. So thank you again for introducing this item.
Thank you, Chair. So this paper will be presented by myself and Nimisha, who's our Assistant Director for Housing Management. So the panel requested an update on our preparation for the regulator's new consumer standards, and we've also placed a particular focus on one of the key areas, which is antisocial behaviour, which what the new standard does focus on. So just by way of background, the social housing regulation was enacted on 20th July last year, and fundamentally the Act aims to improve the condition of social housing and increase resident safety. And equally, what it does is it recognises the need to strengthen the resident voice to be heard, and it greatly enhances the powers of the regulator of social housing. So the regulator of social housing consulted on the new consumer standard last year, and as part of that consultation, we fed back from our perspective our views on what the new consumer standards are and how we feel we can influence and shape the final standards that were published. So the current consumer standards are the home standard, the tenant involvement and empowerment standard, neighbourhood and community standard, the tenancy standard, and then you've got the tenant satisfaction measures. So against the old standard, we obviously did a self-referral against our home standard or breach of home standard. So those old consumer standards will be replaced by the safety and quality standard, the transparency, influence and accountability standard, the neighbourhood and community standard, and the tenancy standard. So very briefly, the first one, which is safety and quality standard, covers the stock condition and quality, including decent homes compliance, health and safety, repairs and maintenance, plan improvement works and adaptations. The transparency and influence and accountability standard really covers fairness and respect for our tenants, appreciating their diverse needs and resident engagement, and also making sure we've got an accessible complaint service. The neighbourhood and community standard covers maintenance of shared space, as well as working in partnership with external and internal providers, safer neighbourhoods. So this is the one that really focuses on ASB management on housing land and on our blocks. And then finally, the tenancy standard, and that covers predominantly Denise's area, which is allocations and lettings. So those are the new standards that will come into effect from April 2024. As part of our preparation towards understanding how we're performing against the new standard, we did invite Housemarque to come along last year to give us a self-assessment of where we think we might be against those standards. So one of the things that they had said to us at the time, which we already knew, was our home standard was weak, but by that time we had already self-referred. And against some of the other areas, it was limited, assurance or adequate. So as a result of their feedback, we've got a housing improvement plan which addresses some of the issues they've identified, and we've set out how we'll be delivering against those to improve the performance against those areas. So I'm more than happy to take any questions on that part of it. I would say we are continuing to do more work against the new consumer standard. So over the next 12 months, we'll be inviting an external company to do a series of mock inspections. So as part of the new inspection regime, the regulator for social housing will be attending once every 4 years to landlords to do an inspection. So in our preparation for those inspections, we're initially going to commission an external company to do a mock inspection, and then we've got a number of management away days planned to make sure we're prepared for any future inspections that may arise. It is probably worth saying, based on the work that we've already done with the regulator, they have been part of our improvement journey, and they've been part of the improvement journey for the last 12 months. When they attended the Housing Improvement Board and they've had sight of our Housing Improvement Plan, one of the things they did comment on was the work we've been doing over the last 12 months really puts us in good stead for future inspections. The slight difference to inspection now compared to 15 years ago was 15 years ago we had the Audit Commission, so they'd come along and inspect landlords, and based on their grading, if you're a 1-star, a 2 or 3-star organisation, they release decent homes funding. There is no funding attached, so there's a C1 to C4 grading that they'll be using, but there is no additional money that will come along if they, rate you as a high-performing landlord.
Thank you. And that kind of links to what I was first going to ask, which was just about what kind of weight these new standards have and what the potential repercussions are if we're sort of found to not be meeting them in any areas, and yeah, sort of how much of a big shift is this going to need to be for the council?
So when the Audit Commission, for example, was dismantled about 15 years ago, housing or local authorities haven't been inspected. Where the inspections have been taking place is in housing associations. So my discussion with the regulator has been focused around what does inspection look like for local councils, because each local council have different governance arrangement, different scrutiny arrangements. What they have said is they've got a proposed set of consumer standards that they're hoping landlords self-assess against, and when they attend different landlords, they look at the different governance arrangements, but they don't necessarily have a key line of inquiry which is all the same for all local authorities. They'll assess it based on each organisation they go and inspect. So there are some things that will be fairly consistent. So do the landlords know their stock? Are they aware of the health and safety requirements? Does the landlord have the right resident engagement structures where residents can feed into service improvement? Are the landlords managing ASB cases well? What is the landlord's complaints process? But in terms of the actual governance, that will vary from organisation to organisation, and they recognise that they don't have a universal approach to that.
And is it fair to say that of the new standards, because of a lot of the improvement work that's already going on, the work to meet most of them is quite developed? But obviously you do mention in this report that our approach to handling ASB is, kind of about to undergo a refresh, and that's maybe an area for more development.
Absolutely, Chair. So I think if we're inspected today, for example, and we are assessed against the new safety and quality standard, I would say I'm quite comfortable with where we are based on the work we've been doing over the last 12 months. There are other standards where we've still got a lot more work we need to do. I'll hand you over to Nimisha, and we'll cover off the ASB aspect of the paper.
Hi everyone. So I'll just talk you through the ASB aspect, and it sets out really how ASB is managed within the housing service. So at the moment it's managed across two teams, which is the ASB enforcement team, which sits under Stronger and Safer Communities, and within tenancy management. And that's governed under a service level agreement, which technically expired in March 2022, but we've continued kind of the principles of that. Within that, we do contribute 90% of funding for that team. And the way the cases are allocated is that the ASB enforcement team manage high-level cases, and the tenancy management team manage low-level cases. And that's kind of generally how it's set out within the service level agreement. In terms of logging cases, that's all done within the ASB enforcement team. When we look at the cases over the last 2 years, and you can see the graph in under 4.27, generally it's, there's a similar amount of cases between the tenancy management team and the ASB enforcement team, but there has been a decline in the number of cases reported to us. And what we do know is that that might not be reflective of what people are experiencing out on our housing estates, but what is logged is that declining line, which you can see there. I think part of the paragraph disappeared under the graph on the printed version, but what it did say there was that when we did our satisfaction survey a year ago, only 43% of tenants were satisfied with the ASB service. So we know that tenant satisfaction is something that we would like to improve. We are currently, and we have been over the last year, working with the enforcement team to improve our KPIs and our data that we get from that service, put in some regular monitoring, and ensure that cases don't sit between teams where they say that's high level, that's low level, and that's been an issue in the past where that handoff is. But that is something we are addressing. We have put in those regular meetings so that we can have some dialogue. And we're also trying to increase our tenancy management visibility on estates as well. So in places like Broadwater Farm and Northumberland Park, we are now there on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, so residents can come and see us. One of the other issues that we face is parking on our estates, and it's an issue for us, a lower level issue. But we're hoping that the new parking enforcement team will address some of that, and certainly with abandoned cars and some of the other issues that we face. I guess one of the other areas that we've been looking at, that we have in terms of our service, is the Safer Estates team. So we piloted in 2018, putting up CCTV on our estates, and it drastically improved kind of the incidents on estates really, and that was quite successful. So now we have a rolling programme within housing of kind of identifying estates which could, deal with those that could have CCTV, and we provide documentary evidence then to police and the ASB enforcement team to take action, and that's yielded real positive results. So, yeah. Happy to
Thanks,
take
Namisha.
questions, yeah.
Thanks. Do any of the panel have questions to begin with? Dawn?
Thank you, Chair. I've got a number of questions about the ASB and enforcement because I get a number of cases, as you can imagine. So will the new approach give more teeth to the council in any way? Examples I have at the moment are CPNs not being enacted by the police, that the council takes action, but it can take literally years. And then once, in one circumstance, a bailiff has been granted to remove the problem resident. That happened in December, and I know from speaking to the team that they have no idea when it will happen because of a backlog, and in the meantime residents are living in quite unsavoury circumstances, to put it mildly. And also you mentioned that you were going to do more regular walkabouts and have a presence on the larger estates. There's quite a lot of much smaller blocks, and most of the ones I get where my ward is, they don't tend to be very large. They do tend to have a lot of issues, and I can speak about more than just my ward on that. And is there a plan for those smaller blocks where I feel it's probably more difficult, but the issues are there?
If I may answer that, is that okay? So just in terms of the measures we use, one of the things we've noticed that is the ASB enforcement team has been reliant on CPWs and CPNs. There are a number of other interventions that you can take under housing legislation through tenancy agreements, such as injunctions with a power of arrest, which is far more effective. And so it is something that we're working with the ASB enforcement team to look at, like that toolbox of measures that you could use, and to have that regular dialogue with us as a housing service around what's worked, and pivot your approach, because one approach won't always work. And that team has relied quite heavily on CPWs, which, as you know, if they breach it, it's a CPN, and then if you still breach it, it's an FPN, whilst an injunction is far more effective. And that's the route we'd really like to kind of work with the enforcement team to go down, is more, some of the other remedies that are available under housing legislation, not necessarily some of the other legislation here.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And just to understand how much support you do get from the police and how much resource they actually have to support, because in some cases I really wouldn't want a council officer going anywhere near some of these residents without police backup, but equally the police aren't able, as far as I can understand, to react very quickly when they're called out. Residents are reluctant to do so because they're frightened for obvious reasons if your neighbour is aggressive. And then even when the council is speaking to the police, they're still not necessarily getting that response that the residents need at times when the council's really closed for business and the police should be there. So are you getting the support you need? Is there anything that can be done?
There's definitely a need for stronger liaison with the police. And what we're doing more frequently now, we have an internal problem-solving partnership group where all the partners come round, and we are flagging issues there in a forum where all the partners are there about what we believe are high-level cases, so that we get a commitment at that level. So we're trying to use the strategic avenues as well as local avenues to raise cases, or where we haven't had intervention. That we've got one block in particular where we sent several videos of things happen in our estates and we didn't get a response, but we raised it at an internal strategic forum and raised it at that level. So we're trying to get the engagement, but could we get, if we could get more police engagement, that would be great. Yes.
Did you have oh, sorry, after you.
Just let all of us know if we can help you in your areas. I know I speak to the Safer Neighbourhood team in mine, and I'm sure others do. So if we can influence the police at all with the resources they have, I'm sure we'd all be happy to.
Khaled.
Thank you. Now, antisocial behaviour, often if it involves drugs, drug dealing and things like that, I know it's a very difficult grey area where police need to be involved. There is very little that council can do. And then when I get casework, police often don't have resources. They're not really interested. And we have the residents, the tenants, who are left in a no man's land with no support from the police nor from the council. I just wanted to understand specifically what enforcement measures the council can put in place when there is definite antisocial behaviour that's been identified, that's been reported. so that's the first question. The second question is, you talked about the Safe Estates program that's been rolled out since 2018, which is an awful long time ago, 6 years, with the rollout of CCTV cameras and so forth. My expectation would be that 6 years down the line, that all of the estates will have been fitted with the state-of-the-art CCTV cameras. Every home should have the same level of protection. So can you provide some indication as to where it's at the moment?
So if I just pick up on the landlord enforcement powers, and Nimisha, if you could pick up the second part. So I think one of the things that we recognise is the way we exercise the landlord function, enforcement function, can improve. So at the moment, the powers that are available to us, where there's ASB in one of our properties or block, is if it's one of our tenants, we can certainly apply to get a notice of seeking possession for the ASB they're causing. If they have an introductory tenancy where you're a new tenant, you've got an introductory tenancy for 12 months, and if you're in breach of the tenancy terms and conditions, you can lose that tenancy. We can issue tenancy warnings and cautions, and as Nimisha has mentioned, we can apply for injunctions and evictions, and also issue acceptable behaviour contracts. Till date, our use of those enforcement powers have been limited. So one of the things that we're working with our colleagues in our corporate enforcement team is to make sure we're maximising on those landlord enforcement powers.
And just on the Safer Estate scheme, it has been successful. And so there is a capital programme every year for the instalment of, key estates. But that is rolled into our wider investment strategy. But there is a commitment to roll that out.
Just to add, I'm not sure there's a desire to have absolutely every council-owned property surveyed by CCTV across the borough. This is, we're putting stuff in where there's a known issue, and it's, it's interactive, and they're watching it can actually shout at people to leave and things like that. It's quite a targeted approach, and I don't think we need to target absolutely everywhere. But obviously, there is a programme of expansion.
John?
Yeah, I mean, the crossover between minor antisocial behaviour and the more serious stuff has always been a problem. So I'm pleased that your TMOs are getting guidance on when they should move it up to the next step, because I think, as I say, that's been a lot of confusion. They try and deal with it, they can't deal with it, they don't move it up, so that's really good. So the consumer standards, none of the tenants know the names of their housing manager. Virtually none of them do. And I'm not quite sure if there's any point in that, because when you phone up now, you can't speak to a specified officer. So how does that come into the consumer standards if the inspectors come here and the tenants say, well, they get the message that nobody knows who their housing manager is? How does it all tie up with online and call centres and all that type of thing?
So as part of the housing improvement plan, one of the things we did last year was we wrote to all of the residents introducing who the housing officer is for their patch. And it's something that we intended to annually, because as you would appreciate, there may be staff turnover. What we don't encourage is a single point of contact, because where you have a single point of contact to an individual's inbox, it also causes a single point of failure. So what we're trying to move towards is inquiries going to a generic work tray. So even if that individual is on annual leave or off sick or not available, that work can be picked up and allocated to someone else. The issue with having a direct contact is if they're not available, then that email goes unanswered for weeks, if not months, if they're on sick leave.
So, I mean, I understand that, and it's quite logical, but is it an actual fact that we shouldn't be telling the residents an individual name? And if that's the case, because it's more efficient and better to do it the way that you've described, should we explain that to the residents? Because the residents do often say to me, I don't know who the housing manager is, and is it really relevant anyway?
I think we want our residents to know who the housing officer is and what they look like. So if they're doing a walkabout on the estate, we'd want residents to be joining on that walkabout. In terms of emailing the officer directly, that's the point I was trying to make, which is we want all emails to go to a generic central inbox, so that work can then be allocated and filtered down to the relevant officer. But in terms of a tenant who may have housing issues or may want to join a walkabout with the housing officer, we certainly want our residents to know who the housing officer is.
Can I just ask firstly, I'll go back to the panel. Obviously, a lot of the time when we have ASB in our council houses, some of it stems from people with vulnerabilities or people from challenging backgrounds who've been placed in general needs housing, maybe with not the right support, or maybe it's not the right type of housing for them. And is our approach to that being considered as part of our sort of wider management of ASB?
I haven't spoken very much, so yes, especially in our sheltered schemes. And it's sort of in Denise's area, we're sort of looking at, we have a lot of pathways for housing, and just to make sure that the support is in place, and all of that is key, I think, in a lot of this. But I think the sheltered schemes is the first area that we're looking to review, how those are operated. I don't know, Denise, have you got more to say on that?
I mean, just to add a little bit, across the piece, it feels like we're seeing it, people are increasingly vulnerable in mainstream housing. And that's a kind of pattern, as obviously there's pressures on other services, etc. So we are doing a piece of work initially, as Councillor Williams says, around sheltered and getting the housing needs of older people and getting that balance across a distinction between sheltered housing that's low level support and, you know, people being checked in, to more sort of structured supported housing where there is a kind of significant mental health issue or drug and alcohol, for example. So that's a piece of work we're doing around the kind of needs there, and then we need to think a bit more about how we differentiate our stock. But it's certainly a pattern across London of increasing vulnerability in mainstream TA, mainstream housing, and it's certainly something we need to look at.
And just kind of related to that question, I feel like we all see this in our casework a lot. We have maybe a household which is a source of a great deal of ASB in a certain bit of the community, and they seem to do things which would clearly breach the tenancy agreement. And I think a lot of the neighbours and people living nearby would sort of wonder why we're not taking sort of stronger action sooner. And I obviously appreciate that you wouldn't want to make a vulnerable person homeless, and maybe taking the tenancy off them might be a last resort. But what is it when we do have those situations where it just seems to go on for so long? I mean, is it that we don't have anywhere else to put them? Is it that these processes just take a really long time? Is it that we just don't have any options, or is it something else?
So if I come in on that, I think when we have done the review in the past few months, I think one of the things we've found is that we don't communicate what we do. So sometimes there's a lot of work going on in the background, looking at lower level interventions. It could be an initial warning in the first instance, and then if there's a breach, another warning. We may then try and put in place some sort of agreement with the resident. So there'll be all of these actions going on, but what we haven't been very good at is telling people, and so it looks like nothing's happening. So one of the things internally we are now introducing is when someone initially reports something, we're trying to put together a bit of an action plan that we can communicate back to residents so they understand what's happening. So sometimes if we do take someone for eviction or possession, we do have to build a body of evidence around all of the other things that we've tried before we get there. So even though someone's behaviour, might look like they've initially breached it, we do have to build that body of evidence as well.
Thanks, Holly.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to note that the term antisocial behaviour can obviously be a bit difficult, although it has its legal definitions, but it obviously covers quite a wide range of behaviour, from things that are criminal to things that are not criminal. And we don't want to be creating a system where we're contributing to criminalising behaviours of our tenants that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if they were the same behaviours happening by homeowners or private residents. So I think it's positive that in the paper we focused on some preventative things like the parking. I think that's really positive. And the door entry systems. I think that's definitely preferable to the cameras, because there's obviously privacy issues around the use of the cameras as well, that they are also going to be capturing quite a lot of data from residents who aren't necessarily causing any problems. So yeah, I guess my question really was about how we're deciding the priorities for the door entry systems. I can think of one estate in particular where the residents have been asking for years for a door entry system. I'm sure other people will have examples like that off the top of their heads, but yeah, how are we prioritising that?
So in terms of the safer estate schemes, it is based upon our knowledge of potential ASB or criminality happening in the area and how vulnerable those blocks are potentially for people coming in. And, you know, if they need an upgrade, that's when we'll have a look at it.
Okay, so is that something that's happening in conversation with residents' associations? Because one of the other things I was thinking about was that, just from my own experience of casework, it seems to be that strong residents' associations are a really positive kind of protective factor about these kinds of issues happening on estates.
So one of the things we are trying to do is to increase the number of resident associations and resident engagement, because you're right, when people come together, their voices are stronger and they can advocate for things in their local area. And that is something that, you know, we're keen on doing. And associated with that, we, you know, under the housing improvement plan, you know, we've committed to small estate improvement budgets as well for each area. And our intention is that for each area, with the residents, we identify improvements that we can make to the local area, and each area has that pot of money that they can feed into. There'll be larger, you know, requests on money for things like door entry systems, but it is through that engagement that, you know, we want to start and have that conversation with, really.
I think it's just worth noting sometimes installing a door entry system is not necessarily the solution. Often when you have ASB in blocks, it's those living in the block that are letting the perpetrators in. So over the last 12 months, one of the things that we've done is where we've had particular blocks that have come to our attention where there's high levels of ASB, rather than installing a door entry system, we've installed CCTV, so we can build up the evidence of where the ASB is occurring from, then take tenancy management action against those who are causing it. We have in recent times taken more extreme examples where for certain blocks where there's high levels of ASB, drug abuse, we've put in 24-hour patrol service with a dog warden, because often you can have a door entry system. These perpetrators vandalise the door entry system, they get in, we go and repair the door, they still vandalise it and get back in. So we're having to look at alternative options on how we can move the ASB along outside of our blocks and on our land. Often, as Councillor Barnes has said, the police are also stretched, so there's limited resource available to deal with some of the issues we've got on our blocks and estates.
I think broadly, ultimately, the solution to antisocial behaviour isn't steel bars. You know, we do obviously go in and make interventions like that, and it's very disappointing to see that. So that isn't the solution. I think it's probably a people-based solution. So when it's really terrible, that is like we've had to do, put in dog patrols through the night in some places, and also having relationships, tenancy management, Namisha's team, knowing who's where, who's vulnerable, who might be vulnerable to cuckooing, who, who's, all of that sort of side of things, I think will deliver a better outcome for residents than the sort of more, metal grills on everything approach.
Tammy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear to us that antisocial behaviour isn't caused by, not having enough cameras. It's caused by systemic cuts to our welfare system and to drug and alcohol addiction services, amongst others. So obviously we don't have the power or the money to invest like we need to, but it's worth bearing that in mind in this conversation, because it is people who have vulnerabilities at the heart of it. That wasn't what I wanted to ask about. I actually wanted to just maybe to come back about repairs service and communications, because I saw that was highlighted as one of the areas that it was seen that we were not quite meeting our standards at. And I know that previously we've talked about the need to prioritise compliance first before moving on to repairs. And one example, again, in my ward, Edgecote Grove, they had someone coming in and saying we were going to do repairs. There was lots of positivity, and then that person went off sick, and then that major repair kind of process seemed to just completely stop, and residents then were left completely in the dark about what was going on and whether those repairs were happening. So I guess, yeah, my question really is, like, when are we going to start to prioritise the repair works and the major works? And like how can we refocus on those communications, especially in the context as well of the ongoing industrial action? So it would be good to have an update on where we are with that, just because I know we mentioned it last time.
Yeah, I'll let Jahed come in with some more detail, but I mean, broadly, it's you can't prioritise everything at the same time, is a truism, I know, but there's a lot of extra resource gone into the repairs service. But also, as we see the major works coming forward, the reactive repairs should reduce. So if you talk about Edgecote Grove, I mean, a lot of that was a major work that needed to be done there, which has now been done. So if we're more, that work has been really beavered away at to get a good programme for our major works. We've got the partnering contract, hopefully getting that in place really soon. Then we'll be able to actually start doing those major works, which will then put less pressure on the reactive responsive repairs service.
Thank you, Councillor, for the question. I think it's just worth noting the repair service complete around 55,000 repairs a year, and about 1% results in formal complaint. Having said that, we clearly acknowledge the repair service is not where it needs to be in terms of performance and quality. We have seen the repair service being stretched, certainly over the last 15 to 18 months, due to the backlog they had and the increase in damp and mould referrals they've had and the increase in disrepair cases. I have been negotiating with colleagues from the union on an alternative repairs model. So I've met with colleagues on that particular proposed model. We've discussed what the benefits are, and I've also met with the workforce. That does mean that there needs to be an agreement to changes to terms and conditions in order to deliver the new proposed model. So we're still currently in the negotiation stage. It's not finalised, but once that's finalised, I can come back to you on and confirm what the proposed model will be. In terms of meeting some of the more wider requirements around annual leave, increasing annual leave and London waiting, those requirements have been met. So we're just waiting for the unions to come back on the proposal at this stage.
Could I just go back to one of the tables in the report it's the one that goes over the text, 4.27. Because you mentioned that the data for the high-level cases is actually all of the ASB team's cases. It's not just the housing ones. So do we actually know how many high-level housing cases are being dealt with by that team?
On our investigation, it's about 50% of the cases with the ASB enforcement team are housing related. And that's what we found.
Okay. And at the moment, what's a rough definition of what constitutes high level?
So just as an example, it would be things like drug dealing, criminality, threats of violence. So it is that kind of high level threshold, or persistence. So something might start off as low level, but if it's persistent and consistent or directed at an individual, that would then be high level. Yeah.
And could I just ask as well about our residents who live in housing association properties? Because I know that quite often they will come to us if they feel that their ASB case is not being dealt with well by the housing association. There's often, in my experience, there often seems to be issues with data collection and all that sort of thing. In sort of looking at our approach, is that being considered, sort of how we work with non-council tenants as well, or is this obviously all focused on council tenants?
This paper is council tenants. On more broadly on the registered providers, we had a registered providers roundtable last week or the week before, but unfortunately the largest provider in the borough didn't attend. But speaking with the registered providers there, they do say they have their own antisocial behaviour teams, but they'll probably be a bigger area based, dependent. It's all very different. But what is good that we, if that have that round table and meet, and that's every 6 months. So if there are issues, we can feed them directly. And we have an officer at the council who deals with all of the registered providers as well. Yeah.
So that would, if I'm a resident living in a housing association property and I'm not satisfied with how they're dealing with my noise complaint, for example, would I be going to a council officer who specifically deals with housing associations, or would I be going to Namisha's team?
No, so it wouldn't be going to Namisha or us, it would be going to the housing association, and if they're still not satisfied, they can complain to the housing ombudsman.
Holly?
Thanks. I just wanted to touch on something that came up in response to Alex's question, that about 50% of the cases that the ASB and enforcement team deal with relate to social housing. I just wanted to ask how that matches up with housing providing 90% of their funding. Is that 90% of their funding contributing to their work on those cases that don't involve our tenants, or is that like 90% of the 50%?
So we've currently got a service level agreement with the corporate enforcement team. So we're now reviewing what we're paying against what services are being provided, just to make sure that the recharge mechanism is fair and accurate.
And when are we going to have a new up-to-date SLA, do you think?
Namisha is currently in discussions with our corporate enforcement team to define what the new SLA will entail, and then potentially what more housing we'll be doing, potentially for more high-level ASB, because at the moment that's dealt centrally through the corporate enforcement team. So there's some discussions taking place around what that looks like going forward.
Come back.
Yeah, I think it's positive then that we're working on a new SLA, and I think it would be positive as well if maybe we could get an update in future, because obviously it's kind of problematic for our tenants to be funding the work that's not relating to them.
Yeah, in the future, myself and I can invite Barry, who's the corporate director, to come along to go through the revised model and what enhanced service our residents will be receiving. Yeah.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody. I'm going to move us on to the next agenda item, which is about our use of the community infrastructure levy. So I think, is it Rob to introduce this, or?
My colleague Bryce Tudball can talk through the headlines on it, who's Head of Planning Policy, Transport and Infrastructure. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
Thank you both. So this report comprises essentially a background paper on the community infrastructure levy. Important to note that this is a major source of funding towards new and improved infrastructure in the borough. Alongside Section 106, it's the key mechanism through which we get money from developers towards infrastructure improvements. So I won't go through all the detail in the paper, but the law sets out how CIL should be apportioned. The council can keep up to 5% of CIL receipts to cover its administration expenses. CIL is then divided into two types: neighboured CIL, which is the smaller element of CIL, designed to be spent on more local projects, and then the bigger portion of CIL, which comprises between 70 and 80% of CIL receipts, is strategic CIL, and that's generally designed to be spent on your bigger ticket infrastructure. So the council has been quite active in the CIL space. So we've had an adopted CIL charging schedule since 2014. That's what the council needs in order to be able to charge CIL. Now, we did go through the process in the last few years of revising that CIL charging schedule. So we've got an up-to-date charging schedule as of 2022. One of the key things that process did was to increase CIL rates in the east of the borough, recognising that the investment the council put in the east of the borough and the increase in property and land values that's taken place over the last 10 years or so. So for the purpose of charging CIL, it operates essentially as a flat rate tax. There are charges for different uses. And those charges change depending on which area of the borough we are talking about. So for charging purposes, CIL is split into 3 charging zones: the west of the borough, the centre of the borough and the east of the borough. And each of those has separate charges which are set out in the report. So just in terms of strategic CIL, so the council is required by law to spend that on infrastructure, and the definition of infrastructure is set out in law. That includes things like roads and transport, flood defences, educational facilities, etc. Now, the council has its own adopted guidance around the spend of both strategic CIL and neighbourhood CIL. Now, the key parts of the guidance in relation to strategic CIL are that it should be spent on CIL eligible projects within the council's capital programme, taking into account the council's infrastructure list and relevant infrastructure evidence. Important to note also, there will always be competing demands for strategic CIL and neighbourhood CIL, so decisions about the spend of it need to take account of those competing demands. And the council has made a number of fairly major allocations of strategic CIL in previous years. So in 2020, £14.5 million was allocated towards a variety of projects in the capital programme. And actually very recently, as part of the budget setting process for next year, £9.7 million of strategic CIL was allocated to walking and cycling projects, road danger reduction projects and school streets. And what that did, that £9.7 million, was that effectively emptied the strategic CIL pot. So in order for the council to make any further substantial CIL allocations, we'll need to wait for more CIL funding to accrue, which it does on a fairly regular basis as applications come forwards and developments begin on site. So just in terms of neighbourhood CIL quickly, so this is a smaller element of CIL. The council has its adopted governance arrangements in place for neighbourhood CIL. To note, the adopted governance arrangements for neighbourhood CIL originally derived from Scrutiny committee advice about 10 years ago. So that was the genesis of some of those. But what the governance does is it breaks down the borough into a series of areas. I think it's 9 off the top of my head. And then there is a formula in place which essentially distributes money having regard to where it's collected, and also takes account of an element of redistribution having regard to infrastructure needs, and also having regard to the amount of development which took place. If we were just to distribute neighbourhood seal based on where it was collected, then there will be some quite perverse impacts because, for instance, seal rates in the west of the borough are substantially higher than seal rates in the east of the borough. So to get the same amount of money per house, you need to have some kind of equalisation formula. We've also been quite active in terms of allocating NSIL. So in 2020, we allocated over £2 million towards a variety of smaller neighbourhood scale projects. We'll be looking this year to go through the process of allocating a further £1.7 million of neighbourhood seal. And this is money which we accrued up to the end of March 2022. And as part of that, we're looking to potentially go through the process of a participatory budgeting pilot. And that's having regard to the fact that participatory budgeting was a key objective within the corporate delivery plan. Having regard to the changes in the ward boundaries in May 2022, we do need to relook at how we make decisions about the spend and allocation of NSIL in the future, because that does have some implications for how our approach works. So we're proposing later this year to relook at that, potentially with a view to reducing some of the complexity. And then just finally, two key points, one around reporting on SIL. So there are legal requirements about how we report on a variety of SIL matters. The key document we publish is called an infrastructure funding statement, which addresses both SIL and Section 106. And we'll be publishing our 22-23 infrastructure funding statement within, I expect, the next 4 weeks. That's kind of really the Bible when it comes to SIL and Section 106 within Haringey. And then finally, most of you will be aware that there was a planning peer review challenge which took place recently in the borough, and actually last night Cabinet endorsed the report and the associated action plan. To note, that does include a couple of recommendations around SIL and neighbourhood SIL, and there are some actions in there around that, but particularly using SIL as a tool to engage local communities. Having regard to the fact that it's not often we have opportunities to engage people around money we have to spend, it's often about money we have to not spend, budgets we have to reduce, and also making clear that SIL is something we receive from developers, so it's a positive for development in people's area, and making that case quite clear. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks a lot, Bryce. Any questions to begin with? Holly?
Thanks. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the reasoning for the differences in charges between the parts of the borough and how those rates are calculated. I also noticed that it was back in 2014 that the rates were increased, but obviously the price of land in the borough has changed a lot since 2014. So what's the reasoning and when is that updated?
Yeah, very good question. So SIL rates are set based on viability evidence. The viability evidence that we've collected is very clear that viability is better in the west of the borough and centre of the borough than the east of the borough. That's why there is a difference in the rates. You are correct in identifying that there is a substantial difference in the rates between different parts of the borough. We did re-look at the SIL rates beginning in 2017, and that bit of work did identify that there was scope to increase rates in the east of the borough, but not elsewhere in the borough. So we did go through the process of doing a revised SIL charging schedule, which was adopted in 2022. So as it currently stands, those rates across the borough are at around the maximum we can charge without putting delivery of development at risk.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Tammy?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my head around the neighbourhood SIL element, so it's more just of a clarifying question. But would it be that if there was a development in Highgate, say, in the zone, that 25% of the neighbourhood SIL from that development would stay in Highgate, whereas if there was development, say, in Tottenham Hale, then all of that money would then be redistributed along the lines outlined in the document?
The law sets out that where there is an adopted neighbourhood plan in place, that the neighbourhood planning group are able to keep 25% of total SIL receipts within that area, for the purposes of infrastructure. And actually, that's one of the major incentives behind getting an adopted neighbourhood in place. We only have one in the borough, as you're aware. Where there's not a neighbourhood plan in place, adopted neighbourhood plan, then the percentage which needs to be set aside for neighbourhood SIL is 15%, which is a little bit lower, as you say. We're not able to redistribute money which has been collected within neighbourhood plan area, but where we have other areas without neighbourhood plans, we have that flexibility to do that, and we do have a formula which seeks to redistribute neighbourhood SIL, having regard to a range of factors, including amount of development that's taking place and a need for infrastructure. The formula we've got at the moment rebalances SIL towards the east of the borough, having regard to the fact that infrastructure need is evidenced to be higher there.
Dawn.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions and kind of relates a little to the NSIL as well. But one is, what is the difference in how much has been generated from the Eastern SIL over the last period compared to Western? Because it's significantly more money. I'm not sure that there's an awful lot of development in the West at the moment on the same levels. So what kind of money has been generated? And then I noticed that the school streets, for example, have been funded. So that's across the borough, right? So any school can apply for that money. I think that's correct, but just tell me if I'm wrong. And then Crouch End was trying to get its neighbourhood plan together when I was a councillor there, which is a while ago, and they've been trying before I was a councillor there. Is there anything the council can do to chivvy them along? Because you can't spend the money, can you, until they have that plan in place? And so is that just sitting in a bank account desperately awaiting spending? Sorry, and one last thing, the Stroud Green and Finsbury Park one, again, like Crouch End, do you have any idea on a time frame for that actually going through approval so those residents can spend money in that area?
Thank you. So I'll take the Crouch End point first. So we did look to allocate money to projects within Crouch End back in 2022. The Crouch End Neighbourhood Forum at that point wasn't quite ready to engage in that process and asked us to hold off, and we did on that basis. We do recognise that there is a need to get that money spent now, and whilst there's not a neighbourhood plan in place yet, we are committed to working with both the Neighbourhood Forum to get that money spent on priority projects, but also with local people as well, which is important. So we do intend to get that money allocated, hopefully later this year as part of the next NSIL spending round. So in relation to strategic SIL, which is the bigger portion of SIL, that can be spent anywhere within the borough. So money collected in Highgate or Muswell Hill from strategic SIL can be spent anywhere. You're right in saying that school streets could be anywhere in the borough. So street SIL is being used for a variety of projects, walking and cycling projects, road danger reduction projects across the borough. Yeah, and then your first point was around the level of development which has taken place in different parts of the borough. Yeah, so I don't have the figures offhand, but the figures do show that the majority of SIL raise comes within the centre of the borough and the east of the borough. I think it's fair then that a lot of that money gets reinvested in those parts of the borough. The rates in the west of the borough are higher than elsewhere in the borough, but because we have less development, it ultimately results in less SIL. We do recognise there is a need to be proportionate in how we spend NSIL as well. So as part of the NSIL formula, there is a redistribution of money towards areas that have seen the most amount of development.
Thank you, Chair. So would there be an argument at some point to relook at the cost in the west of SIL because there is less development and why those opportunities aren't taking place? But that would depend on the figures that you get back to see whether or not that matters or not so much.
So in terms of the SIL rates in the west of the borough, so the evidence shows that the SIL rates are about right, so it shouldn't be the SIL rates which are impacting substantially on the amount of development that comes forward. I think it's probably more a reflection of the fact that there are fewer development opportunities in the west of the borough and fewer major development opportunities. Notwithstanding that, as part of the new local plan, we are looking to deliver placemaking improvements across the entire borough. So we will be looking carefully at what can be brought forward in the west of the borough, which may potentially result in more SIL and neighbourhood SIL to spend in the west of the boroughs, according to the formula. Yeah.
I'm going to go to Khaled in a second, but just to clarify on something that came up then. So, and I have read the papers, but sorry, this is quite complicated. So with neighbourhood SIL, you obviously mentioned neighbourhood forums. They have powers to actually choose what is done with that money presently, right? So at the moment, I know we've got these plans for participatory budgeting and stuff, but at the moment, what happens for areas that don't have neighbourhood forums established? Who's deciding on how NSIL is spent there at the moment?
When there is an adopted neighbourhood plan in place, that money which is raised within that neighbourhood plan area is required to be ring-fenced to be spent within that area. Notwithstanding that, it's not for the neighbourhood forum to set out exactly how that should be spent. Their views should be taken into account, but there should also be input from other people who live within the area who may or may not be involved with the neighbourhood forum. So it's not just what they want at their pet projects, for example. So that would be the position on that front. And I'm very sorry, I forgot the second part of your...
It was about kind of how decisions are made about NSIL in areas that don't have neighbourhood forums.
Yeah, sorry. All spending of neighbourhood SIL should be informed by engagement with local communities. So the money which we allocated in 2022 was informed by a borough-wide engagement exercise in 2018, where people identified what their priorities were for infrastructure improvements within their area. So a key element of a second NSIL spending round later this year will be a borough-wide engagement where we go out to communities and ask people what their spending priorities are. So that will include engagement with neighbourhood forums where they exist, and where they don't exist, it will involve tapping into key community groups to get an indication around what their priorities might be, but also building on the back of things like Shaping Wood Green, which was an extensive engagement project, and also Tottenham Voices recently, where we asked kind of questions about infrastructure priorities and what people would like to see.
All right, thank you. Khaled, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so the amount that remains unallocated from 2022, 1.73 million, is that still the same amount that we have going into 2024, or has that increased? That's the first part of the question. The second part is this business about the participatory budgeting pilot, where you aim to consult residents. But is there an opportunity for, say, community voluntary groups, charities to access some money so that they spend it themselves, or is it that you just consult them, but the spending is through the council?
So it's correct that £1.74 million was the money which was available up until the end of March 2022. We have accrued further monies since that point, which will be available for spend. But before they are available for spend, what we will need to do is we'll need to review the kind of NSIL spending approach, having regard to the fact that the wall boundaries in the areas no longer exist in a kind of administrative sense. And then your second question in relation to participatory budgeting, there is no agreed approach to participatory budgeting at the moment. We've had some initial discussions across the council with officers and with members. There are a variety of routes we could take. One route could be the council spending money on projects, or another route maybe to give the money over to community groups to spend on their projects that they would deliver themselves. There's benefits and drawbacks to both approaches, but we don't have an agreed approach at the moment.
I think there was a question there about charities and things. This is for infrastructure. So I think there'd be council-led projects, whatever they are, because that's within the law of how to spend it. Yeah.
Rob, did you want to come back on something from before? Sorry.
Oh yeah, thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, and just to add to what Bryce said earlier, you asked the question about who makes the decisions on neighbourhood civil spend, and Bryce correctly said neighbourhood forums are sort of an important factor in that, but they're not the decision maker. We listen to lots of other voices and the wider community and so on. Just to clarify, the decision maker, it's an executive decision. So the last neighbourhood civil spending decision was actually a leader of the council decision back in 2020. So it would either be another leader decision, cabinet or cabinet member. I suspect the next time we do it, it's likely to be a cabinet decision, and especially if we're looking at a new way of doing it, potentially through participatory budgeting. So just to clarify, the actual decision made is an executive decision of the council. Thank you.
Thank you. I had John and then Tammy.
Yeah, I noticed that in 2020 and 2024, virtually all of the spend went to one cabinet portfolio. When you look at the items here that it can be spent on, they total 11. I'm just making that as a comment, whether that's a reflection on the influence of that portfolio, but it does seem a bit strange that parks and various other things that we're always talking about didn't actually get anything. That's just an observation. And you talk about the boundaries. I think it's good that the boundaries, you get them sorted out and adjusted. So how does that reflect on the existing neighbourhood forum and the ones being set up? I mean, do they have to start again because their boundaries have changed? And then also, it is a long time since these rates were set. And Councillor Diakidis, who's not here, was saying that the rates in Camden, adjacent to the Haringey bit, are just way above ours. So I was just wondering, is it suitable to check whether they need to be adjusted and upgraded?
Thank you, Councillor Bevan. There was an allocation of strategic CIL towards parks projects within, in 2020. So I don't think it's fair to say that it was just in favour of one portfolio. There was a spread of projects, but there was a kind of extensive exercise that went on at that time, officer engagement, member engagement, and it was decided that there were certain priorities for that spend. In relation to the boundaries, so we do need to relook at the boundaries. The starting point is that we would need to respect the boundary of the Highgate Neighbourhood Forum. We look to respect the boundaries of the other neighbourhood forums, which have indicated to me recently they are looking to bring forward plans in the near future. We would need to relook in detail at what we do elsewhere in the borough, having regard to the fact there are no emerging neighbourhood forums at the moment. I don't quite know what the eventual outcome of that process would be, but it will involve officer discussion and member discussion. I would envisage we'd probably end up with a smaller number of neighbourhood areas because 19 areas is a lot in a lot of senses, but that's open to future discussion. And in terms of the rates, so I think in viability terms, we did look at it in 2021, 2022, so that is fairly recent, I think. So we remain fairly confident that the rates are approaching the maximum, which are appropriate in viability terms. If anything, viability may have got worse since that point. So that's always a consideration if we were to go through a full review process and be transparent about what our viability evidence says. That you are correct, the rates in Camden and some of our southern adjoining boroughs are higher. That's a reflection of viability within their individual areas. But if you look at our rates in the context of our neighbours as a whole, I think they're in the kind of right ballpark, taking account of all our neighbours.
Thank you, Chair. And just to add to that as well, and yes, whilst it feels like a long time that the rates were looked at, they were updated recently, as Bryce has just said, in the last couple of years. And actually, they're automatically updated every year for inflation. So that's set in legislation. So they automatically increase. We don't have to do anything. And because inflation's been quite high recently, the rates have actually gone up quite a lot in the last few years, every year. So that's built into the legislation, into the mechanism. And just on the comparison with neighbouring boroughs as well, you know, CIL is just one thing that we capture from developers through developer contributions. We also use Section 106 contributions to get money from developers through that. And as people will know, the main thing that we get through Section 106 contributions is affordable housing. So actually just looking at the SIL alone isn't a full picture of what we capture from developments. It might be that we capture more affordable housing or a more affordable tenure of affordable housing in our borough, which balances it out overall. So it's worth just keeping that in mind. It's not just SIL that we capture from developers. There's a whole range of benefits we get from developers. So it's not quite right to look at comparisons across boroughs. We have different affordable housing policies to neighbouring boroughs as well. Thank you.
Did you want to come in?
Just in terms of it being based on viability, has there ever been any consideration about, because I can see it's like lumped residential together, but obviously if there's a residential unit with 5 homes versus one with 20, the viability calculations I would have thought would have been very different. So has there been any analysis on whether the SIL rates should vary according to the size of a residential development? Because I can see you've also got different use categories also varying.
I think we have given consideration to that previously, and as far as I'm aware, the evidence didn't show any major differences between developments of different size. To note, though, the government's been quite clear that the council shouldn't seek to discriminate against certain types of development which are more viable, and particularly development which is more viable tends to be smaller sites. And the government's been quite clear that the council shouldn't seek to put the delivery of small sites at risk by virtue of asking for more SIL and more Section 106, having regard to the fact that they don't deliver affordable housing.
The other question is, are the areas and the boundaries, are they aligning with some of the areas that we have got in the local plan, or do you think they'll be different?
So what we're looking to do in the local plan is to take a neighbourhood-based approach. So we're looking at between 10 and 12 different neighbourhoods to reflect the actual places as they exist in Haringey. As you'll be aware, places don't necessarily follow ward boundaries or administrative boundaries. So I think for the purposes of the local plan, the neighbourhoods are likely to be quite fuzzy. So they wouldn't have like very tightly defined boundaries. Where does Finsbury Park start and where does Stroud Green start and where does Crouch End start? It's very difficult to identify. As you can appreciate, when we're seeking to divide up pounds and pennies, we do need to have some more tightly defined parameters. So we will need something a bit more tightly defined for SIL purposes. It may look something like our local plan neighbourhoods, but as I said, we're looking to simplify SIL allocation and spend. So it will probably mean fewer areas rather than more. So I suspect it wouldn't be a case that each neighbourhood in the local plan is a neighbourhood for SIL purposes.
Yeah, I guess I'm also just reflecting the feedback from the planning peer review, which obviously was brilliant. So well done to you both for that. But I'm worth saying that, like, if it is over different ward boundaries and if it is also coming at a similar time to the local plan, I think there need to be careful consideration of how, as councillors, we can communicate to our residents about both those processes.
Yeah, thank you. Quite agree. And the local plan engagement process, which will be very broad and very deep, would be an ideal opportunity to communicate to people that these improvements are being delivered in their area off the back of new development and the SIL and Section 106 contributions that those deliver.
Can I just ask a final question, if nobody else has anything? So could you just say a little bit about where deciding what to spend strategic SIL on fits with the sort of wider considerations when we have significant development? So, you know, thinking about the associated, I don't know, like roads that people will be using and transport and hospital places and all this. Do we kind of think in that sort of strategic way, therefore we need to use this bit of money for this amount of things, or is it more holistic?
I think the approach is fairly strategic and holistic. So the government's document sets out that strategic SIL should be spent on eligible projects on the council's capital programme. The capital programme is quite broad and it reflects a range of strategic considerations and it reflects the council's priorities for spend. SIL is just one funding source of many for the overall capital programme. So in actual fact, you can allocate SIL to a lot of projects on the capital programme, and almost where you put it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Nevertheless, it does need to be informed by consideration of infrastructure need in the borough. We've got quite detailed evidence about infrastructure needs, so that has informed previous decisions. So we know that need is greater for certain items, and we know that need is greater for investment in certain areas of the borough. So that's been part of that equation.
When Bryce talks about council priorities, I mean, that's our manifesto pledges and our, what we are prioritising to make sure it gets those key projects continue to be funded, even when obviously the landscape's very difficult borrowing wise.
All right, thanks a lot. I think we can draw that item to a close now. So thank you very much, Bryce and Rob. And we'll move on to final item. Thank you for your patience on under occupation in council homes. I think that's Denise to introduce. Or Rob as well. Sorry, I didn't see you online.
Do you want to start, or should I start?
I think I've got just a couple of bits of data that I thought might be useful for the committee to see that I've just pulled out. So just to sort of give a brief introduction, it's probably worth saying that this work is at a fairly early stage.
Robert, could we just pause you there for a second? Yeah. We've been having some issues with volume on this screen. Philip's just going to see if he can turn it up. Sorry about that. I'll let you know when we have tried to turn it up. Robbie, could you try saying something now?
Yeah, can you hear me better now?
Keep trying, but not right now.
I'll keep trying. If I speak right into my mic, does that make a difference?
Not really. Yeah, can you? We've got our technical expert making some changes. Could you just make some noises for a minute?
I'll make some noise. It's also good to see the size of my head on the screen as well. That's always something brilliant to see from home. Can you hear me better now?
No, I think what we might need to do is just be really silent in this room and everybody just concentrate really hard and do our best.
Okay, I don't know if it's worth trying to use the microphone on his laptop rather than his headset, so that makes a difference.
Could you have a go, maybe just experiment with using the microphone on your laptop rather than your headset? Yeah.
That's right. Is that any better?
Maybe marginally, yeah.
Okay.
let's try now like this. Thank you, and everyone just try and listen in.
Sorry, and apologies, I couldn't be there in person. Unfortunately, it's my non-working day, and my wife had cabinet, so I had to look after the kids earlier in the evening. Just to sort of introduce this item. I think it's probably a starting point rather than a complete item, but I think the census data from 2021 gives us some really interesting reflections about under occupation, our stock. And I think the sort of key message that it brings us is that actually, although we've traditionally known about our problems with overcrowding, what the data very clearly presents to us is that we are actually under occupying slightly more than we are overcrowded. And so better use of our stock and particularly encouraging right sizing could be an enormous tool in addressing overcrowding. And I'm just gonna share a bit of data that I can hopefully get up here. So as you can see, put it on the first slide. So I just put it
We can't see it just yet. Now we can.
I can narrate until he comes back. 46% of council 4-bed homes are under-occupied, so that's nearly half of them. And when you move over to 5 beds, 61% of 5-bed homes are under-occupied. And for 5-bed home, people on our register would wait very many years to get one, and will be most probably overcrowded while they wait all those years. And the children might have even grown up by the time they get a 5-bed.
Are you still with us, Robbie? Don't think so. Shall we go to Denise, and then if we can get Robbie back with that other slide, that would be good.
Yeah, I mean, all I'd add really is that the information in the census in 2021 was really stark in highlighting this imbalance of sort of overcrowding and under occupation. So this is a really fundamental piece of work for us. We intend to review our approach to under occupation. It came up through the allocations policy piece of work that we're doing, that making the best use of our stock is really important. So currently we have one under occupation officer who works with people who've expressed an interest in moving. He gets referrals from housing benefit when someone applies for a discretionary housing payment, and from tenancy management. But we're very reliant at the moment on people coming forward and wanting to work with us to move. We do have an incentive scheme for downsizing, but it's not as substantial as some other boroughs, for example. What is key, though, is where people have the opportunity to move to. So we've seen comparatively limited moves during this year, so only 18 this financial year, but we do have another 13 pending, of which 8 are waiting to move into Walter Tull. So I think when new build development happens, particularly if it's in the locality where someone is living in an under-occupied property, it opens up a real opportunity. So it just feels timely, alongside the new build programme, recognising this information in the census, to do a real push around under-occupation. So our intention is to do some work with under-occupiers to co-produce an approach. It will be a range of things, I think. For some people, it's about the support, because this is obviously a really big move if that's been your family home for 30 years or longer. For some people, it is about the money, and if there's a big incentive, they will just go and do their own thing elsewhere. Whereas for others, it's about the offer we can make them still in Haringey. So we are keen to look at the full range of things that can happen, and it feels like this is a kind of timely point to start the discussion, because it is one of our key priorities for the year ahead. And
Thanks,
Robbie.
Denise. Yeah, Robbie, we were able to see your first slide, and Sarah kind of talked us through it. If you could maybe try to share the second slide and say what you were going to say about that.
I think the second slide may well crash my computer again. So I'll just share. I'll just tell you what's in it. So essentially, if you look at our family housing, we actually have very few households with children, so actual families in them. So if you take our 3-bedroom homes, actually only 42% of our 3-bedroom, of the 3-bedroom socially rented homes in the borough have households with dependent children in them. For 4-bedroom homes, it's just over half, with 53%. And 5-bedroom homes, again, it's less than half. Only 44% of our 5-bedroom homes actually have any dependent children in them. And I think, those are, that with the under occupation figures are quite stark about how our family housing is being used at this moment in time.
Thank you. Yeah, that is really interesting, and I know that this has been something of interest to this panel previously as well. And I appreciate that the work is, you know, maybe in quite early stages, but I think, yeah, it's good for us to have a look at it at this stage. Does anyone have any questions so far? Khaled first.
Yeah, I do remember discussing this in a previous meeting, and one of the interesting facts that emerge is that the number of homes that are under-occupied as opposed to overcrowded homes, the numbers are almost the same. So, you know, in an ideal world, a straightforward swap would sort out the problem. But obviously, the problem with that is the security of tenure that tenants have. So even if they're in a 5-bed or a 4-bed home, even if it is severely under-occupied, that's their family home in which they're entitled to live. Now, my question is in relation to the incentivization scheme. The first thing that strikes me is if it is somebody's family home that you're asking to give up, the amounts that are in the papers is not remotely enough for somebody to be, you know, attracted, to be interested to take that up. But the question I wanted to ask is, to what extent can you proactively engage with those who are, because we know who they are in under-occupied homes, without pressurizing them? I mean, what is the extent to which we can engage with them, explain to them and say, look, this is all the support that we can provide? Can we say, look, there is a chronic shortage of housing and there are people in severe overcrowded homes, that if you were able to move, it would, you know, sort of mean that another family that's overcrowded would be able to move into that house. Just wanted to understand how much can we push this?
I think that's a really good question. It is the question, really. Obviously, these are people's homes. Why would they want to move? I mean, they might. But I think we're sort of at the very beginning of a process. One officer is clearly not anything like the sort of numbers of officers we need working in this space, given that half of our council stock is not right-sized currently. So I don't think we're at a point yet of being able to say exactly what incentives would look like, but they're certainly not about pulling, in my view, they shouldn't be about pulling at anyone's heartstrings and saying, look at you rattling around here when there's somebody, you know, with lots of children all squashed in down the road. It is about having relationships, having processes in place that do involve incentives, whether they be financial help, that you get, you know, obviously it's a big incentive if you're moving to a new build, where your bills are going to be negligible. You know, there'll be many things, I think, as the piece of work goes through with Denise and the team, and Robbie, sorry, online.
Could I ask, are there any examples of good practice in maybe other boroughs or other local authorities where they've really managed to shift the dial with this and they've had really successful incentive schemes, or maybe not even in specifically housing, but I mean, I guess anything where you have to sort of incentivize people to do things that they're not legally obliged to do? Are there any sort of learnings that we can take from other places that we're aware of so far?
So we've been looking at what other boroughs and other councils in general do, and we will be doing more of that as part of this process. There's a kind of, I think, largely it's about having a range of options that might appeal to people. So some places, and we did used to have this here historically, for example, have a transferable discount scheme where if someone's under occupying and doesn't want to buy their own house that they're in, for example, through the right to buy, you can give them a transferable discount to go and buy elsewhere, do shared ownership, etc. We don't do that currently. It does have some success. because it allows people to make a different start if that's what they want to do. For some people, particularly where it's older people wanting to move near to family, so there's the Seaside and Country Homes scheme that we subscribe to, which is social housing in, as it suggests, at the seaside, etc. So it's a handful of each thing, I think, that makes a difference based on the particular person's circumstances, but I think we need to make sure we offer that full range. And I do acknowledge that our incentives currently are pretty low compared to others. So yeah, I was very much towards that lower end. So again, looking at the difference that makes. It's not always the biggest difference, people. You know, it's sometimes, as I said, about the offer they'll get. And some boroughs, as part of their new build programme, have tried to think about the sort of design that would appeal to someone to move like in their late 50s and 60s. What that might look like, I don't quite know. But, you know, something that appeals to the sort to why people would want to move. So I think a full range of options for people that we can put to them seems important.
Dawn?
Thanks. I suspect we probably don't know exactly where everybody is and what's under and over occupied, do we? I get the sense that we don't have that information. And given how difficult Jawahad was saying it is to get people to allow the council in to do their repairs to make their homes decent, they're probably not going to be very happy always to respond. But I do think it's about asking the question, because I know my mum and her husband at the moment are thinking, actually, we're beginning to struggle a bit in our home. It's a bit big and we don't really like the stairs anymore. And so it might be that some people don't even need an incentive. So it might be that we look at doing some kind of tailored scheme or tiered scheme where your opening offer is it's this much, but we have a band which you can go up to, because some people won't be motivated by money and some will be very. You can't do anything if you're offering somebody a property 3 bus rides away from where their family live when they're walking around the corner. So there's just going to be so many different ones, but I think it's a good piece of work to try and undertake. It's the engagement I really think that's key. So that's not a question. I just think there's a lot in here that could be developed. But if we could get more people into houses that are appropriate and off the waiting lists, I think it's a really good thing, but it's quite sensitive and emotional, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, I think they're very good points. And I think the immediate issue that comes to mind for me when we talk about not everyone wants money, well, it certainly wouldn't be very fair not to give everyone the money, whether they wanted it or not. Yeah, it's... Maybe. I don't think that would work, because I think once you found out that your neighbour was given a substantial sum of money to do the same, I think there might be some legal cases.
Did you have a question, Holly?
Yeah, so sorry, I'm getting feedback on this. I was just thinking about that's better, about family structures and how they change as children age. So if we have examples where perhaps a house was suitable for a family when they moved in, children have grown up, but adult children are still living in the home, do we consider those people under-occupied, or would they not fall under this kind of definition if the adult children is still part of the household? And then related to that, I know that some housing associations and in some other places offer incentives where households would like to split up if there are adult children living in properties, around being able to house adult children, even if maybe they wouldn't be priority need and wouldn't be able to make an application usually. Is that something that we're looking at?
I think if we can hear Robbie, he would tell you what those things are. Should we give him a go?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, not too bad.
Yeah. So I think absolutely. I think in terms of under occupation, and we wouldn't consider people with adult children occupying rooms under occupying. We only consider it under occupying if the rooms aren't being occupied. In terms of the idea of splitting tenancies, I think it's something we're really actively considering. I think it is potentially quite a good avenue to freeing up, particularly some of the larger homes that we've got in. And I think it probably will form quite an important tool in our, in the sort of range of approaches that we use.
Yeah, that's really positive to hear. I think also just in terms of thinking about fairness and the kind of feedback that residents give, I think it's really positive when people who've grown up in the borough in council housing are able to stay in the borough and sort of feel that connection here, because something we hear about a lot is people who've grown up in council housing feel pushed out of London when they come to look for places by themselves because of how difficult the private rented sector is.
The people in the social housing are sort of the lucky ones. I mean, in the private rented sector is we all know, difficult place to be. So yeah, the council tenancy is a good thing.
Could I ask where this fits in, or maybe it doesn't fit in with the sort of existing home swap scheme? It's not something I know a huge amount about, but obviously, if at the moment, if somebody wants to try and arrange a home swap, I believe that's kind of done through like it's an external scheme, and they have to sort of organise it and find it themselves, but then they do have to receive a bit of support from the council and kind of information and documents and stuff. And I've had a couple of cases myself where I think that process hasn't been massively smooth or helped that smoothly by the council. So I wonder if that plays into this kind of initiative and how it fits in.
Yeah, so home swap would just be an alternative option. So if someone wanted to go down the home swapper route, as a council, we do subscribe to it, so people can sign up and look to do that matching. But this would be us being much more involved in that and looking to offer a property.
So is the difference that home swap is obviously, it's not just our borough, it's kind of all different places across the UK are involved, I think, or at least in London.
Yeah, it's national, and people look to arrange them swaps between them. So you need to find someone else who wants to swap with you and then make that arrangement. So
I suppose ideally in order to be able to be as strategic as possible with our housing stock, we'd want to make our scheme a lot more appealing than the home swap scheme potentially. John?
Yeah, assuming we knew the people that were under occupation and where they were, so say we built 100 2- and 3-bedroom houses, could we not let them at all, only to people who are under occupying, assuming we knew the numbers? Is it legal for us to say we built these houses, they're only going to be used by people who are moving from under occupied properties? Is that legal, or how would that affect the people in Band A and all that business? Because that would actually free up lots of large houses for the people who are at the top of the need bands, to be quite honest.
Do you want to go in? No. And I think the neighbourhood moves has sort of done that. That scheme, that's where we've seen this movement, has been through the neighbourhood move scheme when we're building new stuff. I'll let Denise come in.
I mean, as long as an area is covered in our allocations policy, which under occupation is one of our key priorities that gets Band A anyway, whenever a development happens, you can decide to do a local lettings plan that describes how you will let it. So you could say first priority will go to under occupiers in this scheme, for example, and look at your people who are local and try and do that sort of matching. You couldn't do it too often because across the allocation scheme, we do need to kind of meet a whole range of needs, but you could do a scheme and do it in a targeted way as a one-off.
I wonder, Robbie, with his house building head on, wants to come in on Ashley Road. Oh, I see a hand.
Yeah, it's worth saying that actually, the neighbourhood move scheme is really successful, and generally, between sort of a third and a half of the homes in our bigger schemes tend to go through the neighbourhood move scheme, and we're generally seeing about as many people who are under occupying as people who are overcrowded. getting the right size home. So it is a tool that's working quite effectively with our new build.
Robbie, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about plans at Ashley Road.
Oh, Ashley Road Depot, yes, certainly. So Ashley Road Depot, if people will remember, we originally had proposed a scheme that was 50% private, 50% council rent. However, as the sort of economic circumstances changed, we were able to negotiate a better grant deal with the GLA. What that meant was we were able to make the entire scheme council rent for 272 homes. But what that does mean is we do have a much higher. We have a couple of blocks that are largely 1 and 2 beds, because primarily that was what we were looking at for private sale. So what we're looking to do differently now is we're looking at a specific older person's product. So, with a view that we will design and market these homes with a view to very much targeting people who are underoccupied at the moment.
That sounds great. Thank you. John?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I suppose it'd be nice to get feedback on how successful that is, but obviously it's probably a little way in the future. But I mean, there's lots of people living on their own, and they would jump at a nice new little smaller place, So whether we could get some feedback, but as I say, it might not be for a year or two.
Yeah, absolutely.
We could do an initial look at the neighbourhood move scheme and the people who've moved through that. So we have moved under occupiers there, and share some information on that and just take a bit of learning from what's happened there.
Dawn?
Thank you. So just on neighbourhood moves, I've come across residents who are desperately trying to move, and other people might not want their property because they do research in the area and find out about ASB in that particular street or next door and so on. It will only affect the odd 1 or 2, but that is an issue with neighbourhood moves for some residents who are desperate to move. Yeah, that's a problem we have.
So for the neighbourhood move scheme, people can apply, they move, we then re-let their property to someone else. So it shouldn't be a problem in neighbourhood moves. It might be a problem with something like Home Swapper, that where they advertise their property, then they do research and don't want to swap. But neighbourhood moves should be fine. No.
Definitely is an issue at that level.
Yeah.
All right. I think we can wrap this item up unless anyone's got anything else burning. No? All right. Well, thanks very much. Thanks, Denise and Robbie. So we'll move to item 11, which is the work programme update. So that's just to note our work programme for the year. If anyone's got any comments, but obviously this is the last panel meeting of the financial year, and next year's will come together after annual council and whoever the next chair of this panel is. John and then Tammy, you had comments.
Well, from what you said, I'm not sure if this is the time or to suggest new work areas, because I was thinking of the under occupation 1 officer and their aim to change that, whether that could be part of our work stream. And the other issue that concerns me is a lot, which I've mentioned before, is all the new build properties, all the landscaping around it, which basically the Park Service does not have any resource to maintain. Not like some of these, like the chocolate factory, all that building around there, that is all going to be maintained perfectly. Could that be an item for a future work plan?
We did have a recommendation on that in our response to the budget for the coming year. So we did get a response from the cabinet member to our recommendation on that. So I'd have a look at that. But we can also note that you're interested in looking at that in more detail, and we can note about this wanting to pick this issue up again in the future as well. Did you want to add something, Tammy?
It was just to say that I noted obviously that you presented the report to the cabinet about the private sector rented review, and obviously it was disappointing that not all of the recommendations were accepted. So I'm wondering if we can also make some space as a panel just to discuss that. But I guess we're not going to have a meeting before the AGM, which makes it a bit tricky. But perhaps we could have it might be useful to have an informal check-in and debrief so that any learnings of that process could be fed into the next panel, particularly how to make our recommendations. I don't know why, I think they were very strong personally, but I think maybe thinking about how we can make our recommendations to hold greater weight with the Cabinet.
Sure, yeah, and I guess it's probably a collective piece of learning across all the scrutiny bodies. But I mean, in terms of the review itself, so what we usually do is about 9 months after it's agreed by Cabinet, we'll have a follow-up come to a panel meeting. And so the officers will give an update on the recommendations and the extent to which they've been implemented or not, as it may be. So like, as a matter of course, there will be a follow-up update to this panel on the PRS review that we've done.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I guess I was more thinking about how, as a scrutiny panel, we can make our like recommendations as effective as possible. But I don't know. Yeah, but like, it was frustrating that some basic things, for example, like a private renters charter, they were very lukewarm about accepting, and you know, for example, like supporting more people to get rent repayment orders. That was a big thing that came out of it. Well, yeah, I can do.
I'm very happy to have a discussion about that offline as a panel, whether that takes place before annual council or not. Anybody else? Okay, we'll move on to items of urgent business. There are none. Future meeting dates are to be announced. So yeah, just want to say thank you very much, everybody, for all of your hard work this past year. I think we've had some really good meetings, and yeah, enjoy a slight break from this panel. Thank you.